In our last change project session, we created artwork in response to the water cycle in the rainforest. In the next session, we would have looked at the different levels of light in the rainforest through cyanotypes, an ancient photography method. So this is a version of a cyanotype here, and basically what happens is you paint a chemical onto some paper and then you put objects down on it and the sunlight reacts with the paper. So any areas that haven't had an object on will go a really nice dark blue. So next we'll go a bit more into the process behind cyanotypes and how you make them. So today we're going to be doing a bit of cyanotype printing. So that's this kind of thing. So it's done with sunlight. So it's created by putting some chemicals onto a piece of paper. In this case I've used watercolour paper because it's really kind of, we're going to do a lot of cleaning it off in water, so you need something that's really resilient to that. So you can get loads of different effects. So if I hold this one a little bit closer, this has got lots of lovely plants on it, a bird outline, a dandelion leaf there which is really nice, and then we've got one over here with some pegs on it, some little kind of glass pebbles, so you get a really interesting kind of translucent effect at the bottom. And then this is an example of what happens if you do one on quite a dull day and you don't let it develop long enough. So we're going to try and avoid that today. So I've been waiting, there's a really big rain cloud overhead, so I've been waiting for that to pass, so hopefully we've got lovely sunshine on the way, so this will work. So this is again an example of when it goes a little bit wrong, so you can see a very kind of vague print, but it's not particularly working. This one's gone quite nicely, but it's not been exposed for quite long enough. So you can do this under a UV lamp inside, but it's much better if you can get some really lovely UV actual sunlight. Plus it's just nice to be out in the sunshine as well. So another example there. So what we're going to do is, the first thing you always have to do is a test strip, just to see how long you need to expose it for. So I'm keeping this all in a bag like this. And that's because the black bag will block out all of the sunshine, so it won't react with this. Because what happens is when this, in fact I'll bring you a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. Is that working there? Yeah, there we go. So this thing here, you can kind of see the green on the paper, so that's where I've put the chemicals on. So what we're doing here is a bit of a test strip. So every minute I'm going to move this up a little bit so that you can see the kind of definition between how long it's been exposed for. So then once that's all completed, you should be able to kind of see how long you should expose it for. So we'll move that along another little bit now. And then we'll move this back a bit. So while that's going over there, we'll get a sheet out. And then what I'll do is explain a bit more of the scientific process behind this while this is developing, because that will take a little while. So it's always good to, when you first get it out, leave it face side down just so it's not getting exposed, because you can sort of see the shadows here, so that just means that sunlight's getting a little bit stronger. Move this one along a little bit more so you can kind of see all of the stages going along there. So what we've got here is lots of different types of plants. We've got, what have we got? We've got a toucan, because why not? Who doesn't love a toucan? And some dandelion leaves, so they'll look absolutely lovely on this because they're a really strong shape. And we've just got some weird little things like little flags and just interesting shapes. So we'll turn this over and then we have to act quickly. Oh no, the wind's going to make this tricky. So we'll put toucan there. Some of these on. And you have to try and make sure that they're held down in the same place, just so that you don't get a shadow. Oh no, this is the problem with doing it outside. So we'll try and do this, putting this underneath here instead. I don't know where the toucan has blown away to. Oh, I can see not a toucan, but something slightly different. So we've got a macaw here, so we'll use that guy instead. So we'll pop that one under there, and then on top we're going to put some slightly heavier things to weigh it down, and so that we'll get some interesting shapes from those as well. So let's move this along a little bit. So we'll pop this over there, And we've just got lots of interesting different leaves. So we'll pop them on. So now for a bit of a history and science segment. So while that's all setting and kind of exposing with the sunlight, I'll tell you a little bit about the history of cyanotypes. So they were invented in 1842 by John Herschel. So they were initially used for a way to kind of make really like old-fashioned copies of things. So they were used in technical drawings and by engineers as the first form of blueprint, so that's where that word comes from. So they'd have something on a sheet of plastic and like have all of the plans drawn out, put it on top of this, and then you'd have an exact copy of it. So that's a really like nice way that it's like, it was initially used for kind of technical purposes, but now it's all used for art, and it's really lovely, and not much of the process has changed at all. So it involves applying a solution, so it's two different chemicals that you mix together, and they're non-toxic chemicals, so they're quite nice to use. Still wouldn't like drink them or anything. So it's kind of iron compounds, so it's a mixture of potassium ferricyanide and ferric ammonia citrate, which I always have to double check, so I've got a thing there telling me what it is, just because they're very complicated words. And so when they mix together, they react with the sunlight. So what's happening down here, and I'll move that a little bit and mark it off. So when these chemicals are exposed to UV rays, they change in colour. So you might be able to see this out of the corner, that this has gone from a kind of bright green to a much duller, kind of darker green. And when it reacts, you get this really lovely dark blue colour, like this kind of thing. So then what we're going to do later is put it in water, agitate it a little bit, and that what will happen then is the water will react with the leftover chemicals on here, so it will take away any chemical that hasn't developed and hasn't reacted with the sunlight, and it will take away any of the bits here where it's covered and the UV rays aren't getting through. It will just wash those away, because those bits of the chemicals won't have reacted with UV rays, so they just get washed straight off. I'm trying to think if I need to tell you anything else. Yeah, so it just sets the colour as well, and as it dries it turns into this much nicer, darker blue. So on this little sheet here, my little test strip, I can see that I've already done this for about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 minutes, and it's getting quite a kind of nice dark colour already. So, going everywhere. So what I'll do now is turn this off and leave this a few more minutes, just so it's got a really good time to develop, and then I'll show you what it's going to look like at the end. So now, if we go back to this little test strip over here, then if I pick it up, I've left the very end of it covered up over here. So what this block of wood is doing is just stopping bits of it being exposed as you go along. So if I bring that out, you can kind of see the colour difference between this bit that hasn't been exposed to UV rays and this bit which has been. So if I kind of float that around for a little second, then it should start to get a bit darker. So if we count this, so expose this so far for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 minutes. So what we're going to do is give this a little wash in some water and see if it looks like that's long enough. So I've got a little bit of vinegar here, because sometimes tap water can be ever so slightly alkaline and you need a tiny bit of acid just to neutralise it. So you can use stuff like vinegar, or you could use citric acid, so there's all sorts of things really, maybe even like a little bit of coffee. So you put this in and we're just going to slosh it around, and what you should see very quickly is it's changed to blue. So you can see, I'll get the last of that off, and it's best to do this under running water, so if you can do it under a tap after you've first done this, it's the best thing. So you can sort of see the colour change right at the bottom. So even when it's been exposed for just 3 minutes, you're still getting a really nice colour all the way through to this really nice blue at the end. A very nice cyan blue, so this process is called cyanotypes because of the kind of colour of blue it goes to. So now I reckon it means that this should be ready to go, because normally I'll do this test and I've had a few where it's just come out all white, so it's always good to do a little test just in case. So we'll take this out and you can see here the colour changing that's going on in that already. So we'll put that straight into here, and it might, because of all of the wind, stuff might have gone a little bit kind of fuzzy. We'll see how it looks. Yeah, that's looking good. So it has kind of, there's a few areas where it's gone a little bit weird, and that's because it's such a windy day. But that's quite a nice print. So what I'm going to do is keep washing that, and then I'll show you how it looks in the end in a little bit. So I've moved things inside now so that we're away from the wind. And what I've done is, on this one, I've dropped a few bits of water on it. So what happens when you put water on it before it's exposed is all of the chemicals start to react and start to kind of disintegrate a little bit more. So we'll have a really nice, interesting effect going across the middle here. But I'll show you a little bit more of that in a bit. So back to how this relates to the rainforest. So in the rainforest you have the emergent layer, which is the very tallest trees which reach above the canopy, so they're really, really tall. So those are the bits that get all of the sunlight, so that's the really dark blue. Then you have the canopy layer, which gets 99% of the sunlight. So this transparent snake print here, that works really well, and this lace, because that lets through a lot of sunlight, so that's a really good visual representation of the canopy. Then you have the understory. This is where small trees and shrubs live, and there's not much light here. It only gets 5% of the sunlight coming through it. So this is the bit that ends up a really kind of pale blue, so kind of where those scissors are, the areas around the edges of things and the very slight shadows, that's a really good representation of the understory. So the forest floor is really, really dark. This is where most of the big predators in the rainforest would live. So that only gets 2% of sunlight. So things like those scissors, the really white area in the air, like right in the middle, that's a really good representation of the forest floor. So now we're going to think a little bit more about transparency and what objects would let light through. So these little things here, they're very see-through, so they're a bit more like the canopy layer. So lots of sunlight's coming through, but you still have a little bit of obstruction from the emergent layer. Whereas something like this little dinosaur here, if you held this up to the light, you wouldn't be able to see anything through it. So that's a really good representation of the forest floor, because you might get a little bit of sunlight coming around it, but not through the actual object. So now, as we think about all of those different layers, we're going to create a cyanotype based on that idea. So this piece of paper is coated in that chemical compound that I was saying about earlier. So we're going to put that as a representation of the canopy. That'll be the canopy as well, so quite see-through. So these little stars here are a bit more like the understory. They'll obstruct a fair bit of light, but they'll still let a little bit through to the bottom layer. So a few more bits for the understory here, some little see-through trees and a teeny tiny person, because even though that's a really solid shape, because it's not completely flat at the back, it will let a load of sunlight through underneath it. And then for the forest floor, we've got these objects, which are all incredibly solid, shouldn't let much sunlight through at all. You might get a little bit of a bleed through it, but on the forest floor there'd be 2% sunlight anyway, so that's kind of to represent that. So then we've got loads of greenery to add in. So a lot of these, they're a bit tricky because some of them, if they sit flat to the paper, they'll represent the forest floor because they won't let much light through. Whereas those kind of, that little bundle of leaves at the top, that will probably let quite a lot through, so that's a bit more of a canopy area. So as we can't do this in class, instead we'll be doing our own artwork versions of cyanotypes. But while you're doing this, I want you to really think about everything that we've been going over with cyanotypes here and kind of create an outline of lots of different objects. So you're going to draw around them all, and then you're going to create artwork around them that creates a cyanotype-like image. So you have to think about how much sunlight each of these objects is going to let in. Like those leaves I've just put down, they're not sat completely flat to the paper, so they'd probably get a little bit of light bleeding into them, whereas that piece of dandelion leaf, that's quite flat, so that wouldn't let much sunlight through. Those scissors as well would probably have a small bit of paler blue around them and then some bright white in the middle of them. So you're going to put your objects down, draw around them and think about how transparent they would be. Once you've drawn around everything, you can start colouring in around it in lots of different ways. So I've started with pens here, but you can colour it in any way you like. I would just start thinking about how much the objects that you've drawn around would block out the sunlight. So with this leaf, it will probably block out quite a lot of sunlight, so you'd leave a lot of white in between. But if it was something that had more translucent edges to it, then you could colour the inside of the shape a much paler blue, or kind of something like this where it like changes colour a little bit. With these scissors you can see how it's not an exact outline of the scissors, and because they're not completely flat to the surface, they would have much more fuzzy edges than how you've drawn around them. And with something like this bit of greenery down here, it's got really fuzzy edges and lets loads of light through, so you can really play around with mark making. And you don't just have to stick to one medium, you can if you like, but you can try pens, pencils, watercolours, all sorts. And you could do lots of different versions of this, so you could do one in one medium, another in a different type, or you could do like I'm doing here where you try loads of different things out on the same piece and end up with something that's a really lovely mixed media piece of artwork. You can use any materials that you've got in the house, so you can try out some drawing ink, you can do some collage, you can get scraps of just kind of found objects and create a really interesting piece. And depending on what thing you use, like with this drawing ink, it gives you a really good solid line. So because I'm going around this dinosaur here and it would have a really kind of bold silhouette, I'm using this so that it gives it a really sharp outline, and you can achieve that with pens as well, like this. And if you want a kind of fuzzier edge and not such a strong colour, you can always go over it with pencil as well. So you see how on that cyanotype the leaf has like quite a lot of blue in it. You could always do that as well and shade it in. So another thing you can do is, in the last session we did some work with tissue paper and water to get a really interesting kind of almost watercolour effect from the tissue paper. So you could always do something like that where you kind of try and transfer the pigment down through, and you could use this as a way to kind of create a collage as well. So you could go over it with water or you could glue it down, totally up to you. I'm going to do a little bit of both on this one. You can use a little bit of paint too if you like and blend it, so you could get a few different types of blue. You could add in a little bit of white as well and create some really interesting colour tones. Paint's really good for a really solid colour as well if you want to go for any of that. If you want, you can do numerous versions of this as well in different styles. So on this one, rather than doing lots and lots of solid blue colours, I'm going to focus on mark making instead and just create a really interesting kind of slightly kind of psychedelic piece of artwork, just using lots of different patterns. So there's loads of different artists that use mark making. So you just do loads of like little dots, cross hatches, lines, all sorts of different things, just to give kind of an impression of an overall colour, where when you look at it close up there's lots of really interesting things. So you can make it much more detailed than this if you like, and do loads and loads of dots on top of each other, loads of little crosses, loads of squiggles, all sorts of stuff. Another fun thing you can do is often you can kind of use felt tips a bit like watercolours. So if you do a drawing like this and you decide you wanted to change some of it a little bit, then you could just get a paintbrush, get a little bit of water on it, and literally just go over it. And you might not want to do it if you've put loads of detail into it and you want to keep that detail. But if you just wanted to do a little kind of rough drawing with some felt tip and go over it with some water, you get some really, really lovely, kind of really nice watercolour effects. It's quite a fun technique to play around with. So have a go at making your own cyanotypes at home just by drawing around things and using any art materials that you have around the house to create some really, really interesting, unique pieces of artwork. And as you're doing it, think about all of those different layers in the rainforest, how you're going to represent them through different colours, like the outside bits would be a bit darker, the inner bits a bit lighter to represent the forest floor.